All right. Hello, everybody. We're starting back in 2 minutes, so get your asses down here. All right, everyone, give it up for our announcer, Johnny Evocalio. Thanks, Gary, but it's pronounced Yanni. That Gary, man, I'm gonna get fired. Cool. So, how about those first talks this morning? I had so many interesting conversations there at the coffee area with all of you as the people are just really into this stuff. I heard, oh, we can finally get rid of Redux with Apollo Link State. It's like, I'm not saying that's a good idea, but that's something you could do. So this is an event about the community. So please go and talk to the speakers on the breaks because we are not doing Q&A. Also talk to each other. And in order to facilitate this, I want you to do something for me right now. And yeah, it's going to be a bit awkward, but it's going to be okay. Don't worry. What I want you to do is look around you. Look to your left or to your right or ahead of you or behind you and find somebody that you did not come here with. And now make eye contact with them. Just do it. Stop looking at me. Look at each other. You're still looking at me. Still looking at me. And now introduce yourself to that person. Nothing more than just a name. Just shake hands. All right, that's pretty much enough. Nobody has that long a name, people. All right, so that person, I hope that you remember their name. I hope you remember their faces, because they are now your official React conference buddy. True story. So when you're on next break, when you're having lunch, if you, like, you know that every conference there's a weird time where you're just like wandering around and kind of like hovering into different conversations. You just like end up standing at the edge of a circle, kind of listening in. Just go find your conference buddy and just ask them, hey, what was your favorite talk? What are you excited about? Because we're all here for the same reason. We're just into React and we like, you know, hearing about it, we like talking about it. So talk to each other, all right? Cool. So, I would now like to bring on stage our next speaker, David Gomez. He works at MemSQL, where they love GraphQL servers so much that they are putting GraphQL servers into the browser. And that's what David's going to be talking about. Give a level 5 applause for David. 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. David.
All right, thank you for the amazing introduction. So the title is GraphQL servers in the browser, but a better title would have been GraphQL servers in the client, because the browser is not really the only client that we're going to be talking about. So I always like to start out with why I'm giving this talk, so that I can adjust your mind to the purpose of me being here. Oh wow, that is hard to read. Around 6 months ago, we started exploring with some unconventional use of GraphQL. This is over at MemSQL, where I am a software engineer. And we want to sort of contribute to the discussion of using GraphQL as a solution to new and interesting problems. And hopefully what we learned is useful to somebody else in the future. So let's get started. I'll have to give you guys some context about what we're building at MemSQL. So if you don't care about our database startup, just pretend you do. So we're building a fully client-side application. It starts out with React, and it runs in the browser. But this is where the twist comes. It runs locally, and it connects locally via WebSocket to a running instance of MemSQL, the database that we develop. Now, most web apps run on some web server on some domain.com. Ours doesn't. Instead, each customer manually sets up this application running on a web server locally on their infrastructure, which usually is actually offline. So we started building this application, and we thought, well, what goes really well with React? And I know some of you are thinking Redux, and that's true. But what goes really well with React for data fetching, it's GraphQL. More specifically, what goes really well with React and GraphQL are GraphQL clients like Apollo and Relay. Now, Peggy already talked about some of the advantages of using a GraphQL client, but let's do a refresher, right? Let's go over some of the advantages of using GraphQL clients. Number one is what I like to call declarativity, if that's even a real word. So declarativity is all about having fully declarative views. Now, at MemSQL, we've been using React since early 2014. So that's over 4 years of React. And one of the biggest reasons why we like it so much is declarative rendering. And when you join GraphQL and a GraphQL client with React, you get declarative rendering here and declarative data fetching as well. The less imperative code lives in our views, the better. The easier it is to maintain our code, the less tests we have to write. Secondly, GraphQL as a language turns out to be very easy and very powerful. It's very easy to express a data need using GraphQL. It's not hard to learn, and it makes debugging and maintaining your views much simpler. Thirdly, when your data fetching layer is declarative, it opens the door for static analysis. So, for instance, Relay, one of the most popular GraphQL clients, has the Relay compiler, which will parse all of your GraphQL queries, the ones you attach to components. It will validate them against your schema, and it will even optimize them. All of this at compile time, so you don't have to spend time writing tests for basic things like, is my component getting data that even exists? And we think that's pretty cool, especially because we're a small team. We don't want to spend time writing useless tests. And then finally, there's all these other things that GraphQL clients give you pretty much for free, like graph caching with Relay, the Apollo cache that Peggy already talked about. Offline persistence is an Apollo feature. There's GraphQL, which is an amazing way to explore your GraphQL API. So I'm sold. GraphQL seems really cool. So let's go back to the architecture that I was telling you about that we have over at MemSQL. And it might not be obvious where our GraphQL server is going to live, right? Most of you probably think it should be on the database, that our database should open up a GraphQL server that clients can connect to. But this doesn't actually make a lot of sense because, so first off, MemSQL is a really complex and large product. Adding a GraphQL server to it would be an immense undertaking. Secondly, there's performance issues where a database should only really do mission-critical database things. It should not be doing other things such as serving a GraphQL server. So you might think, well, why don't you guys have a middleman GraphQL server that sits between the browser and your database? And this would work, but it's another moving piece in our architecture. It opens up the door for a bunch of security issues. It's more overhead in all network traffic, and it's just another thing that our customers have to set up on their infrastructure. So we thought, let's have a GraphQL server in the browser. And all that we have to do is set up a GraphQL schema that allows us to query for the things that we need from our database. But then we can attach those GraphQL queries to our components. So we get all the advantages that I was just telling you about. And how did we actually implement this? So we used a new construct in Apollo 2 called the Apollo link, which is basically like middleware for the Apollo client. And it lets you specify, or it lets you tell Apollo client pretty much how it should perform all GraphQL operations. This includes mutations, queries, and subscriptions. So we implemented our own Apollo link, and it resolves to a web worker. Has anybody here played around with web workers? All right, I see a few hands. So web workers are pretty much allow you to do this. So they are threads for JavaScript browser engines, and they're supported by every major browser since IE 10, I believe. And a GraphQL server is rather lightweight, but at the same time, we want our UI to be butter smooth. And because of that, we decided that our GraphQL server should live inside a web worker, because anything that can potentially take just like more than 10 milliseconds, really, should run separately from our UI, not on the main thread. And so what we did is this architecture where we have a GraphQL server living in the web worker. We have React and Apollo on the main thread, and the rest of the stuff you guys already know about. And we actually tried Apollo and Relay, but I'm going to focus on Apollo for this talk. And so that's it. Like, we have this architecture. Did it work? Like, did we find it was good enough for us? And unfortunately, so sorry for the anticlimactic moment, we actually ended up removing GraphQL from the equation. After some time of developing and iterating on this architecture, we decided that GraphQL was slowing us down. It seemed cool at first, but we had to give it up. And the main reason for this is that we are huge type freaks at MemSQL. We're a small team, so we rely on strongly typed data using flow type, which for those of you who don't know is like TypeScript. We rely on flow heavily to guarantee as much safety as we can. And usually, GraphQL and Flow or GraphQL and TypeScript work fine. But the problem here is that our use case is a little bit different. You can generate Flow types and TypeScript types from GraphQL schemas, but what we would actually need here just doesn't really work well. So we have 3 type layers in our application. We have the backend, which lives in the web worker, and we have the UI, which is React, and we have a GraphQL server and the GraphQL type system in the middle. And there's just not a really easy way to do this without duplicating your type definition. So we need a certain type system there on the far end, and we want to reuse those types here, but then there's the GraphQL type system in the middle, so we have to duplicate our types just to flow them across these 2 type layers. And that becomes really complex. You have to duplicate your type definitions, and it slows you down, because if you want to change something, you have to change it in 2 different places. So this slowed us down. We ended up, there's another reason I'm not going to get into, and we ended up with a different architecture that, yes, it uses Redux in 2018. And I won't really get into it, but it's working really well for us. But now, you guys might be thinking, well, did you really just come all the way here to tell us about why you didn't use GraphQL on the browser? And yeah, I'm going to try and compensate for that. I'm going to talk about other use cases where it might make sense to actually use to actually have a GraphQL server running in the browser. So the first one is managing remote data in fully client-side applications. Now, if you think about it, this is exactly the use case that I just told you about. We're building a fully client-side application, and we had a GraphQL server in the browser. But it didn't work for us for very specific reasons that basically apply to only us and a few other cases. But it might actually make sense for different situations. So here's the file explorer. I built it this week in a couple of hours, and I built it with Electron, React, and I wanted to use GraphQL. And I wanted to use GraphQL for all of those reasons that we talked about, like declarative views. But the file system, it doesn't really expose a GraphQL API. So what I did was I set up a GraphQL server in my Electron application that resolves to file system API methods. So I have this application where all of my views are fully declarative, and I'm using GraphQL, and I'm ripping all of the benefits of GraphQL, even though I'm interacting with an API that is not actually GraphQL. The code is up on GitHub, but disclaimer, it's not really good code. It was written very quickly. Another use case for having GraphQL servers running in the browser is to manage your local and view state with GraphQL. Now, Peggy already talked a lot about this, so I'm not going to get too much into it, but the community is starting to explore this idea of having a GraphQL server, and I'll explain what a server means in a little bit, running in the browser so that you can have all of your data, both remote and local, in the same place, in the same store, and query both states, the local and the remote one, with a single query. So the architecture of Apollo link state uses GraphQL Anywhere, which is a package built by the Apollo team, I believe, that lets you fake a GraphQL server in the client without a schema. They do this for bundle size reasons, but I've seen people use GraphQL Anywhere for all sorts of crazy stuff. Namely, just extracting arbitrary data from large JSON objects. Yes, people are using GraphQL just for that. It's crazy. Thirdly, there's interacting with legacy REST APIs. It's not hard to come up with a political scenario where you cannot replace a REST API with a GraphQL API. This has happened to a few people in the community where they work on a company and they want to use GraphQL on their UI, but they simply cannot replace the REST API. Maybe their company is really REST focused, and the backend team doesn't want to build the GraphQL API. So what do? You set up a GraphQL server in the browser. The GraphQL server resolves to HTTP requests, and you can build your application with React and Apollo or Relay, just like you would build any GraphQL API, but in reality, you're interacting with this REST API. A few people are doing this. I think it's pretty cool. There's a few links on the slides that I'll share later where you can learn more about this. Another really cool example is with serverless backends. So has anybody heard about Firebase here? It's by Google. It's a serverless backend for your application. It's very popular, but they don't expose a GraphQL API. So what Pierre Currency did was he set up a GraphQL server in a web worker, just like we did. This GraphQL server resolves to Firebase API requests, the Firebase JS API, and then Pierre was able to build a React application using Apollo, using GraphQL, using all of the benefits that Apollo gives you, even though Firebase doesn't have a GraphQL API. I think that's really cool. Finally, we might see people query IndexedDB and all sorts of data that you would compute in a web worker using GraphQL. I mean, GraphQL is just a language. You can use it to query any data you want. Why not? Yeah, I know we're probably stretching it a bit here, but who knows? So what have we learned? Number one, we learned that GraphQL is a very generic technology. Even though Facebook created GraphQL as a replacement for REST APIs, we're now starting to see GraphQL being used for all different kinds of things. And I predict that over the next few months, during 2018, we'll be seeing a lot more of GraphQL in new places where we haven't seen it before. It's just a language. It's just a standardized language for data fetching that is much simpler than SQL. And secondly, don't be afraid to get creative when designing an architecture. When my manager came to me and he told me, hey, David, we're going to put a GraphQL server in the browser, inside a web worker, and it's going to work fine. And I thought that was really weird. I thought that was completely insane. But it actually almost worked for us. So go crazy out there. Go crazy with your architectures. But at the same time, do beware that GraphQL could potentially be overkill for some of these use cases. The file explorer I showed you, you could totally write it without GraphQL. It would work fine. You could use Redux. You could not even use Redux. Sometimes the simplest solution is the best solution. So just be careful of not buying into the hype of GraphQL too much, because you could be introducing some unnecessary complexity where there didn't really have to be one. Finally, like Jan said, I work at MemSQL. We are building a distributed high-performance SQL database. We're hiring a senior front-end engineer in San Francisco. We're also hiring for a bunch of other software engineering positions, both in Seattle and San Francisco. Check out our careers page, talk to me in the hallway. I can tell you more about the opportunities we have. And I know there's no Q&A, but thank you all for listening. And if you have any questions or any feedback at all that you'd like to give me, talk to me on Twitter, email me, talk to me in the hallway. And thank you all for listening.
Hi, everyone. So you thought you had enough of me, but no. So I asked Yanni to actually introduce, get out. I asked Yanni to introduce the next speaker because he's a stalker. So actually, Kitsi and I, just last week, got an acceptance to the exact same conference. Pretty much all the conferences that I am in, he's also in, and when he's in there, I'm probably also in there. So he also really likes to think that he's a digital nomad, but in reality just doesn't have a house. He can't really afford a house. And, but his talk is really amazing. I have seen it twice, I think. So give it a round of applause. Like one, like a level 1 round of applause for Kitse.
All right.
10 now, 10, come on, done.
All right. Is my mic on? Usually I start with dumb jokes as slides. So yeah, I have this one and I have this one. Doesn't need explanation. I'm starting with a random thing. It's not about development. I mean, it is about speaking mostly. It's about this term that I started to hate, rockstar developer, like he's a rockstar developer. Let's see what is a rockstar. This is a rockstar. This is everything but a rockstar, all right? So let's make it clear here. And we have another term. After a talk, someone might say, he rocked the stage at ReactConf. The reality is he was reading his notes from made on a plane slides, trembling for 30 minutes. So this is the reality. Rolling Stones rocked the stage in front of 1.5 million people. We don't rock the stage. There's only one guy who goes out and gives a talk with a guitar on stage. I don't know who he is. He rocks the stage. Pretty awesome guy. So I just want to encourage you to apply and talk at conferences because it's really nothing special. Because at the end of the day, we're all code monkeys trying to make weird libraries work together by writing shitty hacks. That's how we are. Thank you. So that being said, I'm Kitse. I'm a rockstar. No. I love front-end. I love open source. I love making products. Lately, I've been focusing for the last 1 year, I think, on teaching. So I made my own thing called React Academy, and I'm focusing on teaching React and JavaScript. So if you have a need for a conference, for a company in any of these technologies, yeah. So today my talk is about, oh, wrong slide, sorry. Let me just change. State management in a GraphQL era. So we heard already, it was weird, the previous speaker was like talking about you shouldn't and you should use GraphQL, and my talk is making similar points, but let's see what is GraphQL first if you're not familiar with it. It's a thing that you're eventually going to replace REST, but you keep telling yourself that you don't need to learn it. I'm going to learn it next month, right? So you're still using REST, and REST looks like this. You're querying a bunch of APIs on the client, and with GraphQL, you can just combine all of these API calls into one query. So your client can describe everything that it needs. The server is going to give it back. So it's much simpler, much more flexible. Let's take it back a little bit about single-page apps. So I think single-page apps ruin everything in web development. We were aiming to make a faster car, but somehow we ended up with that contraption. It's not a faster car, it's a bunk bed car or something. And we put everything on a client, right? So when I say we put everything on a client, what does that mean? State management is forms, routing, inputs, tabs, filters, date picker, menus, blah, 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 a lot of these small things. But the big thing that is complicating state management is this. I don't know if you can see it, it's down there, it's data. So data is the #1 reason why state management is hard. And a lot of people are not getting that. They're just battling with state management, not tackling the right problem that is data in state management. So when I say data, I mean fetching the data, caching the data, reading the data, and then invalidating the cache. So my first single-page app was written in jQuery. This is me writing some spaghetti code. Yeah, applause for jQuery. It was one main.js file. It was main.js. It has 3,000 lines. So I have some code, then I have a calendar plugin right into that file, just with comments. Calendar starts here, code continues here. It was one file, no imports, exports. It was a mess, but it's still in production. It still works. I think the government is using it or something. And it's still in production, but I don't want to be the person who would touch that project ever again. It's terrible. So after that, we moved on to Angular 1 or 2 or just Angular, whatever they call it nowadays. And it made sense. It finally solved all of my problems that I had with jQuery. It split things into like, oh, okay, this is a controller, this is blah, blah, blah. And it sounds good in your head until you explain it to someone else. So my roommate was like, all right, I'm going to hear you about this Angular thing. Just tell me what it is. And I'm like, it's really simple. It's just you have a scope and a root scope. And you put directives into controllers and into factories. And it's like, what the fuck are you talking about? So then I thought, this isn't the right thing. I need to move on to something else that's going to be much simpler. And of course, we got our Lord and Savior, React. I'm not going to dwell on how great it is. We're at a React conference, blah, blah, blah. It's great. It solved all of my problems. So I needed to fetch data in React. And I needed to do this like API calls, right? And I was trying to be too smart with it because I was trying to write my own caching layer mechanism, something weird. And I was just trying to cache the API request by key. So this was the key for the API request. And I just cached that. And I felt smart because there wasn't a loading spinner anymore. But when it came time to actually invalidate that cache, I was like, fuck, what do I do now? And I was trying to find a solution to actually manage data into my apps without using set state and without doing all of this mess with caching and so on. So of course, I fell for the hype. And I decided to ride the Redux hype train. It was pretty popular back then. Everyone was talking about it. And I was like, OK, maybe this is going to solve all of my problems. The verdict is I love Redux and I hate Redux at the same time. I love it because it's a genius concept. If you haven't watched the Egghead video about how to recreate Redux from scratch, you should because it's genius. And I hate it because in most of the scenarios, it's like overkill. And if you don't trust me that it's not needed in most of the situations, let's see what Dan has to say about it. So he's literally telling people that it's overhyped, low level, and often used unnecessarily. He even wrote an article about it. That's like a band releasing an album and telling you not to listen to the album. So that's amazing. And there was this case on Reddit. There was this React beginner. He wanted to learn React, and he was like, hello, Reddit, I just started my first React app. What should I do to do network requests? And of course, the most upvoted answer was this. Number 1. That's like if your friend called you and he was like, there's a spider in my house, and you're like, okay, I'm coming with the bazooka for the spider. It's the same. So right now, there is a poor soul somewhere trying to connect Redux Saga with Redux Form just to make a form that has 2 fields. Username and password. That's terrible. So my roommate wanted to learn Redux, and I was like, all right, I'm going to teach you Redux. I teach people things, right? And we were sitting in a restaurant, actually, and he had this idea for a simple app. He was like, let's make an app that's going to randomize the names of the people in my company, and whoever gets picked, he will get to do the coffee. And I'm like, oh my God, a startup idea. We're going to be millionaires. Let's do it right now at this restaurant. He was like, all right, let's have an index.html and a jQuery file, and we're going to do it. I'm like, no, we need Redux. I'm going to teach you React. I'm going to teach you Redux. It's like, why do we need all of that? I'm like, trust me, it's the best. All right, and we start. We create some actions, some dispatchers, some array, and so on. And it was like day when we entered the restaurant. We left at night. The waiter was looking like, what the fuck is that code, you know? And it was, at that moment, I figured out, like, maybe Redux is an overkill for really simple apps because we're pushing things into array and doing small things. We don't need to use it. So I told him, give me one night. I'm going to try something new. I've been hearing about this new thing, like an alternative way, and I'll let you know tomorrow. And it turned out to be simpler. So for that kind of things, it's really simpler. And from then on, I continued using MobX. It's not like it doesn't have problems when you put data management and fetching and so on in it. So it wasn't the perfect solution for me. What is the problem here? We were always comparing these technologies. Like we had jQuery versus MooTools, and Angular versus Ember, GraphQL versus REST, Redux versus MobX, React versus Vue, Apollo versus Relay. And all right, not needed. The mistake that we're all doing here is we're asking what's better. What's better, Redux or MobX? What's better, React or Vue? It's like, what's applicable for your team, for your use case, for your app? Like, don't fall for the hype train just because someone else is using it. Just evaluate if you need to use it. So in my opinion, I think Trump is great, right? On a golf course. So it's about the context. As a president, he's terrible, but on a golf course, he may be great. So you cannot judge it's bad or good. It's all about the context. Lately in the community, we were seeing all of these things, like hard components suck. We decide that, right? Or like render props are everything. Why cannot we just be in between? A healthy mix of higher order components and render props and use them both when it's appropriate to use the one or the other. Don't just say that one is bad and the other is good. Same thing with Redux. Previously we were like, we need Redux for everything, and nowadays there are like 20 articles declaring Redux is dead. We can replace it with the new context. Like Redux is already using context. What are you going to replace? Like if you're using Redux only to pass down props, you're very wrong. Like I've heard people in my workshop saying, I think I need Redux because I cannot pass this prop from here to here. And that's really wrong. That's why we have context. Now it's official. You can do that. But I would use Redux when my data management, like it's really, really complex. So we need to schedule all of these events with sagas and so on. And we need to do complicated things. Just don't start your React project and pick Redux right away. And yeah, I agree, we need a healthy mix also for this one. So pick it whenever it's appropriate. Let's see some examples of data fetching. So I'm fetching these to-dos with the fetch API. It's nothing special. The same thing if I want to do it with vanilla Redux, no helpers like Redux actions and so on. It takes one slide, and then we have a reducer for another slide. We need to modify and return like pure objects. So with MobX is the same thing, but in one slide we can use a class, bunch of observables, decorators, fetching to-dos. It's still a big slide for just fetching data. And now that we have GraphQL, I'm going to show you the Apollo implementation of fetching data in a component, and we can fit both the data and a component in one slide. So this component can just describe, I need to-dos, I need a title and a date for the to-dos, and they're going to magically go right there into our render method. So we made everything simpler because components can now declare that we need that information. So the problem right here is we were fixing the sink instead of fixing the well. We were battling a different problem. The sink was state management, we were battling with state management, and actually the problem was where does the data come from, and it's REST APIs. So those are the problem. It's not Redux and so on. It's the REST APIs. So if we go back to my previous slide about state management and everything that we had, now if we remove data, for these small things you can do whatever the hell you want, right? Just imagine using MobX or Redux or vanilla set state or whatever for these things. They're easy, right? There's no caching and validating and crazy things. You can easily do routing and tabs and everything else without complicating it. So if you ask me how much lines would we remove if we switch from Redux for fetching data to Apollo for fetching data, it's around 5,000 lines, but you're also adding 1,000 lines. But every logic that you had, I think they kept using Redux here for all the other stuff. But they removed the data fetching layer, which removed 5,000 lines. So the question that we want to answer is, do we even need a state management library when we're using GraphQL? And my answer is always, I don't know. Let's see some examples. Let's see some like stacks that I'm going to propose you. And we're going to start with vanilla. You can go only with Apollo or Relay, whatever you're using, a router library, and vanilla set state. This will work for most of the apps. If you have complicated forms, like you're doing a form in a form in a form or something crazy, you can grab a form library. You don't have to use global state management for this. You can grab a library like Formic or whatever is there, and you can use that to manage your forms. And if your users live in tunnels and you want to use offline support and so on, you can just use Apollo Cache Persist or just a different way of persisting in the cache. Don't go for the state management library. Then we have the next stack that I liked in the last year. It's I want to go home early. The guy from MobX tweeted, MobX doesn't try to prove an academic point, it just wants you to go home early. So that's true. Unless, if you're paid by the hour, just stick with Redux. So we have Apollo, MobX, MobX React Form, and MobX Router. You can make a tiny stack. It's not perfect for all scenarios, but it worked for our app. Then I have another one, I've been experimenting with it. It's with Next. Just use set state, Apollo, and Next.js. It's perfect. It's server-side rendered. You don't even need global state management. But I'm going to suggest you to do something crazy. You're going to be like, oh my God, full page reloads? Who does that? Well, Amazon does that, Airbnb does that, bunch of companies do that, you just don't notice it. So we're all settled on single page apps, and all of these big companies are not doing single page apps. So how about you do an app that looks like this? It's consisted of mini apps, and then to handle the logic in these mini apps for every route, you don't need global state management. You can just use set state and manage the state in all of them separately, because that's what big companies do. Pay attention next time you browse a website. It's not a single page app. So can we use only Apollo? Yes. We can use Apollo link state to have a client-side schema, and it looks something like this. I don't know if this is the official syntax. This slide is a bit old. So you can grab something from the server, but you can also grab data from the client. And this is perfectly describing to the component what does it need, both from the server and from the client. So can we conclude? When using GraphQL, in 90% of the cases, you don't need global state management library. If you need it, you just want to over-engineer things, but we all like doing that sometimes, so I won't blame you. After a conference, you're hearing all of these talks, and you go home, and you're like, holy shit, I need to do so many things, right? You feel bad about whatever you're using right now. Oh, I hate REST. Oh, I hate MobX. I want to switch to that new thing. So I want to switch the talk to something else about this fear of missing out when you're at conferences and you go home. You're like, oh my God, that speaker said you got to use GraphQL. So who am I to tell you what to do in this scenario? You don't know my story. Like, you may work in a huge company with 100 people, and I gave you really wrong information, right? Because it's not the same scenario. So let me tell you a few things about myself, right? I work alone. I don't work for clients anymore, so I'm out of touch for the past, I don't know, year. I don't know what I'm doing. I experiment with a new library every week. And I'm going to make a Christmas tree out of this slide, so would you trust this person? Thank you. So before you opt in and you go home and you use that shiny new technology that the speaker on stage told you about, just evaluate the entire context because you may not need it. Before you follow other people's advice, see if it applies to you. So I'm going to tell you a client project story. We decided we're going to go from REST API and Redux. We went to MobX and Apollo. But Apollo has a really, I don't know, terrible way of managing the cache. It's not terrible, but you got to write a lot of code to manage the cache. And I was like, what if instead of managing the cache after every mutation, we just reload all the data? Not just reload the page, just fetch all the active queries that are on the page right now. And a lot of you might think, oh my God, that's a lot of network requests. It was not. It was around under a kilobyte per network request, and it saved us so much time because the client, it was an MVP, and the client was shifting strategies like every now and then. So every week the client was like, forget about those features we built, now we need to do something else. And just imagine if you write like 300 lines of code for managing Apollo's cache, and then the client is like, nope, we're going to do something else. So in our scenario, I just had one line, data.client.resetStore, which resetted the whole store, fetch the data again. The client didn't notice anything. His clients didn't notice anything. Everyone was happy with the app. At the end, it would have been over-engineering. So just ask yourself, are we over-engineering this? Are we doing it for someone else, just so someone can look at it and say, oh my God, that's perfect code. Congratulations on your reducer or whatever. So I don't go for that. So don't be scared for the network, because few kilobytes of data are better than your entire team spending weeks on making something perfect. Just compare those two things. I used to also over-engineer. I still do it sometimes. It's not like I'm perfect, but I learned to focus on the user, just make the user happy. Because you make that, when you make that login form with Redux Saga, like you have an 8-hour workday, right? And you go for 8 hours, you connect Redux Saga to Redux Form, and you're happy at the end of the day. You're like, oh my God, I did a nice thing. And the user of the app is going to be, I can log in, right? You didn't do anything special for the user. You did it to feel good. You can write a Medium blog post. I did this today. So raise your hand if this is you. I made something, it works, and I think it's awesome, but I'm not sure if it's right. Right? You always have this fear of, oh, what are the thought leaders going to think of my code? Like, who cares, man? You're writing it for yourself. Who knows what is right? Like, have you seen Ryan Florence's component? Is that right? It's amazing. I mean, it's a genius idea, but is it right? I don't know. So just experiment with this kind of crazy ideas without seeking approval every time. I had this friend, he did something with a React router, like, I don't know, he explained me it was pretty crazy. When you go to a new route, instead of seeing a blank page, he did some crazy algorithm for prefetching the next 10 pages. And he was like, it works for our app, but I don't know if it's good. Like, who should tell you if it's good or not? If it works for you, if it works, just keep going, man. Another example, Nomad List. Who knows the site Nomad List? It was written by one guy in PHP and jQuery. So literally no frameworks, no Laravel, no GraphQL, it's not even, I don't know what he's using. It's just one huge PHP file, one jQuery file. Nomad List and a bunch of his other apps are making him $50,000 per month. All right? With PHP and jQuery. His brother, meanwhile, decided, like, they started at the same time. And he was like, I'm going to opt in for the fastest option to deliver something to my users. And he went for PHP and jQuery. And his brother was like, I'm going to learn Meteor. So Meteor is this awesome framework, and he explained everything about Meteor, like real-life sync and whatever it's doing. And after a couple of months, this guy, his brother, had like 20,000 in his bank, and this guy knew Meteor. So he could do a lot of things in Meteor, but that was not the point. Same friend with the router. He's explaining me about his GraphQL stack at work. He's like, we added this crazy layer of like caching data, but also all the resolvers are cached on I don't know what level. And he's speaking for 5 minutes, I'm just dozing off, like, yeah, I know. And I asked him at the end, okay, so what did you do? Was it something for Facebook? Was it like a huge kill? I was like, no, it was just a hospital website. And I'm like, there's not going to be a scenario where the nurse is like, doctor, we're losing him, our landing page is not fast enough. So who gives a fuck? Why are you complicating your stack? So you shouldn't feel bad for not using the latest and greatest. And Sarah, that introduced me, I have a nice example with her. Who hasn't used a service worker, like manually written a service worker? I haven't. I know what they are, but I never felt the need to use it. And Sarah had the need to use it for the ReactFest website. And then people were seeing the old website, so they had to buy a new domain just so they can deploy and redirect to their new domain. So it doesn't mean that the latest and greatest is always best, all right? So to sum up this second part, you should stop seeking external approval. You should stop seeking answers in other people's projects. Your code is sometimes great. Sometimes. Stop feeling insecure about your code before nobody actually knows what they're doing. And for God's sake, delete your Twitter account if you want to feel good about anything. If you like what you're doing, if REST works for you, if Redux works for you, if set state works for you, just forget about what I said and you can move on. You can find more about me. I'm Kidze everywhere, so my site, except on Twitter. Some asshole tweeted once, took my account, and now I'm the Kidze on Twitter. So you can find me there. Thank you very much for listening. That's it. Thanks.
Hello. Perfect. Thank you, Kidze, for amazing talk and also for amazing workshop yesterday. Hands up who've been to the workshop yesterday by Kidze. Amazing. Did you like it? Woo! Cool. Well, I would like to introduce our final speaker during this segment, Susanna, who came originally from, came from React.js Girls, our amazing community, and we are really happy to have actually 4 speakers today who are presenting for the first time. Our aim of the conference was not only to have great, amazing speakers, but also allow opportunity for those who are speaking for the first time at the technical conference. And so Susanna has delivered this talk already at the React.js Girls, which went really amazing. And a little bit about Susanna, she previously has been an architect who started coding then with programming with the architecture program. And now she's a front-end engineer at CNN. And we're going to hear a talk about GraphQL. And after that, we're going to go on a lunch break, and more information will follow after the talk. So please welcome Susanna for her talk about GraphQL.
So, is everyone able to hear me? Yeah. Oh, okay. Oops. Sorry. Sorry. Okay, cool. So everyone could hear me, right? Okay. So today I'm going to talk about taming the beast. The beast is in React and GraphQL. Originally, I was going to include Webpack as well, but with Webpack, it's kind of endless, so it doesn't, it couldn't fit within the 10-minute context here. So I'm just going to focus on React and GraphQL. For the three-headed beast, I started off by Googling what the three-headed beast is. And do we have any Greek here? Oh, okay, cool. So meet Cerberus. Cerberus is this three-headed beast in Greek mythology who kind of guards the underworld. So in some way, I kind of like, oh, it resonates. It's a bit like GraphQL and React, where like kind of guards is this like layer on top of the data, the backend data that you want to fetch. And going along that search, I found this image, and it really resonates with me as being a developer. We are kind of like the guy on the left, who's like, you know, dealing with like React and GraphQL, and like we're busy taming the air as well. There's like all the project managers who on the boat there to, you know, tell you the new features, and also the higher ups who you don't know what's going on, but like, they decide the new features. But okay, enough of my bad joke. So let's move on. So I work for CNN in travel and style, where we work with React, GraphQL, React to make our web app, and GraphQL to create our backend data, and Webpack for the bundling of our web app. So, so the main reason I'm doing this talk is I started learning React about a year ago, and before I actually had a very, very small gig as a developer right out of college. And back then, that was about like 10 years ago, we were working mostly with Java for front end. So anyone heard of that library called Google Web Toolkit? So the idea is to use Java to program, and everything will be compiled to JavaScript. And back then I decided that development is too rigid, I want a more creative lifestyle. So I went on to become an architect, like the real architect, the one who designed the buildings. And I had a lot of fun programming for the 3D environment for the past 8 years. But then I decided development is kind of still much more fun. So I recently decided to go back into development. And yeah, you wouldn't imagine how things has gone the other way, like how JavaScript would go to backend. But anyway, so, and also with front end now, it's a completely different story, how with React and all these frameworks. And they're really, really powerful tools, but at the same time, it's very easy to go in and code JSX and so on. But at the same time, there's actually a lot of some things that are very trivial, but trivial errors that actually really requires your understanding of React. And when I was going in my React learning journey, while I was going through a lot of videos, I realized that there's a really amazing videos about how React works in the backend, but just there aren't too many videos about how people share their fuck-ups and really silly errors while doing the first, having their first React and GraphQL experience. So that's why I'm here. So I'm just hoping to share with you some really could be silly and trivial fuck-ups that that I hope everyone can learn from my mistake. So, so let's start to go on. I'm going to share with you the error that I had in GraphQL and React. So here I am actually let me start with GraphQL, and here I'm setting up a very, very small application which will display it has a gallery that will display pictures. And here I've first set up a GraphQL query, which takes in 2 variables, which is topics and offset. And here how I've set up all the information that I want to grab. And then in my index file, I basically export that query, and I import it back in my component. And in my component, I have set up a fetch query, which will take in our client and take in whatever topics, and offset is pretty much like the variable that so let's say you load 4 images at a time. So so the first offset is 0, the next one is 4, the next one is 8, and so on. So and then fetch data will call fetch query, and then you can do whatever stuff you want to display and style the application in your component. So this is the overall state of everything that you have set up for this very simple component that gets data from GraphQL. So here's the question. So I can change the name from offset to diff. So it's just, I don't know, I'm just too bored. I want to change the name. This is how I set up, right? There is something wrong that I did here. And hint, it will cause you just keep refreshing and be like, oh, where's my data? And yeah, so it's because, you have to go back to your query and to refactor all your variable names to be the same. So every time when you change something in a component, if you change the variable name, you have to remember to go to your query file to change it. I did that, it's something very trivial, but sometimes you're just very into your component and just forget to also take care of your query code, query file. And the next one is, yeah, you just assign offset as the diff. But sometimes it's very confusing because every time you might want to keep your variable name consistent across your query and the component file. So, so this is not very recommended. And okay, so the next, going on to my component. So in my component, I have this button where you click it and then it will load more photos. So, so here I've set up a handle load more class, which we'll call fetch data, and we just fetch the data and re-render the DOM. So there is also like a very fundamentally error embedded in this. Yeah, I'm sure some of you have already figured it out. And this error, by the way, if you read the React docs carefully, you wouldn't have this error. So it's actually, yeah. So it's with the button, the function that you pass on with the handle load more. It would just basically cause the DOM to keep fetch data, set state, render, and yeah, basically an infinite loop that would cause your browser to somehow crash. So the solutions that are provided here are exactly from the React docs, and yeah, so please excuse me if you've already really read your docs. So of course the first way is to pass in the arrow functions in your renders. So, and in this way, all your data is also binded with this arrow function. So whatever you pass into your child props, it will be the state props, whatever, it will be able to be passed on to your child. And the second way is, and I personally think it's maybe it's a best practice, is just basically bind everything in your constructor. So just don't need to worry whether your props will be passed and so on. And the third one is it's kind of like the first one. You just pretty much take your arrow function out and put it in your button on click. But then somehow React does not recommend this method. And if you want to know why, go back and read the docs. And so this is actually the end of my slide, but I had this other error that I have here. This is, so basically, taking on your app, if you want someone to scroll down the pictures, once they click load more in the state we render, you want them to kind of go back to, so we have the photo gallery, and there's a button where let's say you click on the top menu, you close it, and it will brings you back to the place where you had scrolled. So it just basically brings you back to the same scroll position. And again, there is an error embedded in this. But because I am running out of time, so I won't be sharing the solution here. But I have posted this on my Twitter. And also, I will post the solution on my Twitter before ReactFest. So before you guys go all out and enjoy the beer. So yeah, this is my talk, and would love to hear from you guys about sharing the most trivial or errors that you guys could encounter on your React journey. So yeah, that's it. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. Up. Cool. Thanks so much, Susanna. It was a great talk. So now we're gonna head to a break. Just before that, wanted to mention a few things. So we're streaming live. We're on Twitter, on Twitch. We have the link there, so please share. We have a YouTube channel. So all the talks after will be posted there. We're hoping for 1 week. So you can follow our YouTube channel via reactfest.com. And we had some difficulties with Wi-Fi today, but we booked an engineer who's coming now during the lunch break to fix everything. So hopefully after that we can go full power in Twitter. And yes, we're going to take a 1 hour break. We want to very much thank Economist for supporting us and sponsoring our lunch. So we'll take 1 hour for that. Please visit Economist and the other sponsors' booths. Have a chat. One more addition, we're having a jobs board on that corner where everyone who is looking for hiring or to be hired can post their notices. There's going to be some paper that you can write it on, post your business card. And we have community sticker table as well, so if you have some cool stickers, please share. And that's pretty much it. So yeah, thank you so much. And after that, we come back with another half of speakers. Thanks.